So thank you. Thanks, Jonathan, Emily, Paul, for the invite, and Kirsty as well. I feel a bit like I'm piggybacking on the back of a University of Sussex thing. So thank you very much for welcoming in an outsider. The book is not out yet. It was due out originally 2nd of May. It's now going to be 16th of May, I think. So I'm aware that most people in the room won't have had a chance to look at it yet. There's a couple of early copies here, so please feel free to grab them and have a look afterwards if you like. The book was a response to a variety of things, but one of the things it was a response to was these lines from Richard Horton, who is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, which is the epidemiology journal that published some of the early studies that allowed us to realise a pandemic was about to happen. And Richard Horton writes, this was a pandemic that was described and reported in terms of statistics, especially in his journal. Lives were transformed into mathematical summaries, but those who died cannot and should not be summarised. Our way of describing the impacts of the pandemic erased the biographies of the dead. The science and politics of COVID-19 became exercises in radical dehumanisation. And he goes on later in the book to say, so what must we say about the politics of COVID-19? We must say, I think, that it's our task to uncover the biographies of those who've lived and died with COVID-19. It's our task to resist the biologicalisation of the disease and to understand what this disease means to the lives of those it's afflicted. So I was working at the time when I read that on Mass Observations COVID-19 collections, and it struck me that it might be possible to at least respond in part to what Richard Horton was suggesting, using mass observation materials to provide an alternative account to the statistical account, to the epidemiological account of the pandemic, a more humanising account that helped us to understand what living during the pandemic meant to people, how they interpreted it, and also a more democratic account, drawing in voices from across a range of different people in the UK. And it struck me in particular that there was a particular collection within Mass Observations COVID-19 collections that seemed to be very well suited to this. And this was something that Kirsty mentioned earlier, which is the 12th of May 2020 diaries. So I know a lot of people in the room are very familiar with Mass Observation. When it was founded in 1937 as the original Mass Observation, one of its very first projects was the 12th of May 1937 day survey, where they sought to produce an alternative street-level account of the coronation day of George VI. So the Mass Observation Archive set up its own 12th of May project in 2010. Kirsty mentioned that for a number of years, the sponsors were in the few hundreds, really. And then in 12th May 2020, something happened. We were in the middle of a lockdown. Over 5,000 diaries were submitted to Mass Observation. And this struck me as a good collection of sources in which to try and provide this humanising democratic account of the pandemic. So I'll say something briefly about the diarists and then about the diaries. So as Kirsty mentioned, all contributors to the Mass Observation Archive are volunteers. Many of the diarists are what we might think of as the usual suspects. So people who engage with mass observation, archivists, academics, students, teachers, and so on. We should say at the outset, the diarists are not formally representative of the UK population. But across the 5,000 diaries, we get a pretty good range of voices. One way that I tried to emphasise that range was by sampling within the 5,000. So I selected 500, trying to fill quotas for age group, gender, occupational category, region of the UK, and so on. And I think in the book, hopefully you'll see that there are many of what we might think of as the non-usual suspects as well. So I just have a brief list to try and make that point. We've got in the book carers, chaplains, cleaners, company directors, customs officers, delivery drivers, diplomats, doctors, electricians, engineers, farmers, finance managers, hairdressers, midwives, nurses, painters and decorators, sales assistants, and I could go on. So hopefully that gives a sense. The There's plenty more to say about representativeness, but I'm actually going to skip over that because I don't want to get bogged down in the issue of representativeness. Quite happy to come back and talk about it if people want to later. But let me say a little bit about the diaries. All of the diaries were kept on 12th of May 2020. This was a Tuesday towards the end of the spring lockdown, the first lockdown for most people in the UK. But people writing the diaries tend to look backwards over the previous 3 months or so of the pandemic, and also forwards over how they think the pandemic is going to unfold, and also what they think life might be like after the pandemic as well. I've written the blurb for the book that I think the diaries capture much of everyday life in the pandemic for millions of people, including the activities, events and rituals like funerals or homeschooling, the sites and stages on which those events took place, like shops or Zoom, the roles and subject positions people were asked to take up during the pandemic, like key workers or vulnerable groups, the frames through which many people viewed the pandemic, and in the book, I have two of the most prominent frames are luck and the new normal, and the moods of the pandemic, so fear, hope, and so on. Now, one of the big challenges of putting the book together was what to do with 5,000 diaries, or even once I'd sampled, what to do with 500 diaries, how to put together the book, how to select extracts and how to compose those extracts into an anthology. What I ended up doing was reading a lot about how previous people have written about previous pandemics, so from Defoe through Camus to Spinney and so on, and also reading about how people have attempted to notice and to present everyday life in everyday life studies as well. And I ended up generating for myself a set of aphorisms, if you like, to try and follow as I was composing the book. So some aphorisms I took from previous writing about pandemics was keep the scope wide, include multiple portraits from multiple communities, use details to communicate experience, and use this combination of wide scope and details to refuse or to unsettle myths about the people and the way they experienced the pandemic. Then from everyday life studies, I took aphorisms like to communicate experience, present, don't represent, show, don't tell, let quotes be the main work. To avoid humanistic cliche, include multiple voices and perspectives, the familiar and the strange, contradictions and paradoxes. And then to accommodate all of this, use devices from surrealism like fragments, montage, juxtaposition, and use devices from encyclopedias like entries, alphabetized sequencing, and cross-referencing. So all of that gave me a contents page that looks like this. So there's an introductory chapter that discusses previous writing about pandemics and how to narrate a pandemic. There's a concluding chapter that discusses everyday life studies and the challenge of finding a form or an aesthetic to represent or to present everyday life. And then there's a bunch of chapters in the middle that perhaps make up a pandemic encyclopedia. So I'm just going to finish by trying to pull out a few thoughts about politics and feelings in the hope of making some connections to the previous talk. There's lots of politics talk or politics writing contained in many of these entries. If I just take one example, so Clap for Carers, that entry, there's Clap for Carers didn't happen on 12th of May, it happened the previous Thursday. So this was when people were invited to come out of their homes and clap for NHS workers and other key workers and so on. But many people in their diaries felt a need to write about Clap for Carers, and they saw that event as a provocation to do politics writing. So they would write about what C. Wright Mills would call their private troubles and how they connected up to public issues. They would write about being out on the street with their neighbours clapping, and that writing would bleed into writing about how the NHS is funded, how key workers are paid, and so on. So that's just an example of politics writing in some of these entries. There are other entries, of course, that very explicitly pick up on feelings in the pandemic, anxiety, fear, grief, and so on. As I was putting together the book, I found myself thinking about the idea of the Mass Observation Archive as an archive of feeling, which Claire Langer has written about, and I think Jonathan and Emily pick up on as well. And I found myself going back to Anne Krekvich's original book about an archive of feeling, where she thinks of the book as an archive of feeling. And I came to think of this book a little bit like an archive of feeling. It attempts to bridge between the mass observation archive and readers, to pull out some things from the archive and make those things more available to readers, hopefully. I also found myself working with Raymond Williams' idea of structure of feeling, of course. And I was hoping that the book would attempt to capture the experience of the pandemic as much as that would be possible to do, but also to capture what Raymond Williams would call the style of the pandemic, so keywords and manners and so on of the pandemic. So another way of thinking of this contents list is, if one way of thinking of it is a pandemic encyclopedia, another way of thinking of it is a list of pandemic keywords, I guess. So just a final couple of comments on the book's overall politics. I was trying to respond to Richard Horton in producing a humanizing account of the pandemic, an account of the pandemic that I thought would present society as complex, diverse, eccentric, that would undercut myths of the people, that would encourage a modest and careful engagement with others. I was trying to produce a democratic account of the pandemic that gave voice to a range of people. I was also trying to do something which sounds rather grand when I read it out loud, I think, which was to revive what some people who work with mass observation have called a science of the people, by the people, for the people. So science of the people, study of the everyday lives of ordinary people, by the people, involving a wide range of people, mobilizing them as writers to observe their lives and to write about their lives, and then for the people, finding a way of publishing that writing as widely as possible so people can read back what they've written, what other people have written. And overall, the idea is to make the experience of the pandemic and the experience of everyday life available for critique, not just by people like me, human geographers, but by a democracy of people. So that was the grand ambition. Thank you.